no reason. So this morning, I want to talk about responsibility and also this very strange and interesting ritual that is described at the end of the Parashat this week that we read in the Maftir section. Responsibility in the book of Deuteronomy is a pretty interesting concept. There's, we have this expression or this question, if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, does it make a sound? It's supposed to be, a question that we can debate. Deuteronomy has a pretty clear answer, which is that, yes, if something happens, it has an effect. And if evil happens in the world, that in the Deuteronomic mind, it's kind of like pollution. So just because you got away with pollution, it doesn't mean that there now isn't a dirtier environment, a messier place. And that leads to some very interesting questions, including the question that we're going to discuss today, which is a section that's brought up by Deuteronomy. What happens if someone is found dead, but no one knows who the murderer is? On the one hand, we could just say, okay, this is a case that will never be, we're never going to find out who did it. Let's just leave it and move on. And yet, in the mind of Deuteronomy, that's not good enough. Someone has to take responsibility if blood has been shed. So I want to do a few things in our 15 minutes, our quick 15 minutes of learning. I want to look at this ritual. We're going to read it out loud, and I'm going to ask you to turn to someone to think about the specifics of this ritual. Why this ritual for this purpose? And then I want to introduce a kind of rabbinic understanding of this, which I think really powerfully talks about the way that the rabbis understand responsibility in this context. I think has a lot to say about some of the work that we do in this community, in our world. Pretty surprising read, at least to me, of the rabbis. So without further ado, if someone could read in English, or at least start reading this section in source 1, Deuteronomy, just so we can hear the ritual, hear the details of this specific ritual. Rabbi, thank you.
If in the land that your God is assigning you to possess, someone slain is found lying in the open, the identity of the slayer is not being known, your elders and magistrates shall go out and measure the distance from the corpse to the nearby towns. The elders of the town nearest the corpse shall take a heifer which has never been worked, which is never folded in a yoke, and the elders of that town shall bring the heifer down to an ever-flowing wadi, which is not tilled or sown. There in the wadi they shall break the heifer's neck. The priests, son of Levi, shall come forward, for your God has chosen them for divine service and to pronounce blessings in the name of Adonai. And every lawsuit in case of assault is subject to their ruling.
So just before we continue, a body is found. We don't know who the killer is. It seems like we're never going to know, and yet someone has to take responsibility. So the two closest towns take these very giant tape measures and go from the body to their town. And if this part that I didn't excerpt from the Talmud is, of course, they ask, well, what part of the body do you measure from? Did this come up? Did you guys hear in Daf Yomi? Yeah. And then they say, yeah, what part of the town do you measure from? So, of course, they get very deep into the details. They also ask the question, that we're not going to talk about today, what happens if it's equidistant from two towns? What do you do? But in this case, one of the towns is the closer town, and even though they don't know who the killer was, and actually I've been kind of debating this week, do we assume that the killer is from that town, or is it just that we presume they're not from that town specifically? Nevertheless, they need to take responsibility. They are asked to take a heifer who has never been worked to an ever-flowing stream, probably a stream that continually has water through it. And the way that they maybe it's a sacrifice. There's reasons why we might say it's not a sacrifice, but they break the neck of the heifer. And this is done by the priestly class of that community. So that's kind of where we are so far. Robin, will you read the rest of the section?
Then all the elders of the town nearest to the corpse shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the wadi. And they shall make this declaration: our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. Absolve Adonai, your people Israel, whom you redeemed, and do not let guilt for the blood of the innocent remain among your people, the people Israel. And they will be absolved of blood guilt. Thus you will remove from your midst guilt for the blood of the innocent, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of Adonai.
Okay. So I want to ask two questions, and maybe we'll sit and think. This is not the most straightforward ritual, something that we're not really so familiar with. So maybe turn to someone near you for just a few minutes, and two questions. I'm a teacher, so I wish I had a whiteboard or something, but we don't have that on Shabbat. So just visualize that I'm writing the questions. One is, what is the purpose of this ritual sociologically for the community? Why do this? And I think the second question is, why do this in this specific way? Why is the ritual being called out in these? Is there a specific detail that is surprising, that makes sense in the context of why this ritual? So question one, why this ritual? And question two, why are we doing this ritual? Why are we doing this ritual? And then the second question is, why are we doing it in this way? So take a few minutes, we'll come back together. All right, so I want to hear some of the discussions. The truth is that there are a number of, like any good Torah text, there's no right answer at the end of this. There's actually a lot of debate within the rabbinic tradition of what might be happening here. And also when we get the next layer of biblical archaeology, there's whole other traditions. So I don't bring this with an aha, but actually some curiosity about what might be happening here. So some ideas. Bonnie, please.
Well, where we kind of got stuck is that this had to be a very young animal for it to be able to break its neck, that it's never been worked. So it must be a small animal that's young, that you could break its neck, and then what do you do with the animal once that happens?
Yeah. Totally before I forget, the link to this source sheet is embedded under the stream. So if you are streaming, you can click on that link and be a part of this conversation as well. End of public service announcement. So you're touching on something really interesting, and I think pretty clear that there's a lot of details about what kind of animal this needs to be. And the second thing, that the animal then has died. Some suggest that this is like the animal's a replacement for this person. Like, we don't know who did this murder, so we're basically going to do a murder in plain sight and kind of go through the ritual of maybe having some certainty for something that's uncertain. I don't know if two wrongs make a right in that way, but that's one possibility. Please.
Yes, the townspeople killed this animal, but they did not shed any blood while they were killing this animal.
Okay. I think that is so interesting, and especially because in the rest of Torah, we have all these texts about sacrifices where you drain all of the blood and blood is sprinkled on the altar. And this specifically says, break the neck, don't do that. And when they say no blood has been spilled, one of the possibilities is they're saying, right, we didn't spill blood in relation to this person, and we didn't spill blood in relation to this animal. That's brilliant. That's really, really interesting. Johnny.
Otherwise, people might be inclined to use an older animal that they found use out of, and therefore you're not supposed to make sacrifices to Hashem that are, you're supposed to give first fruits, not like right? So like you're giving, it's a real sacrifice, like it's a young animal. But the one that I don't really know what to say about, and I guess I want to hunt for something more insightful, is why and until we're not selling piece of land.
Okay, so two pieces. One, use the word sacrifice. That's another one of the possibilities here, that blood has been spilled and they need to make some kind of offering to God, kind of something terrible has happened, we're going to do this as an atonement. And they choose an animal that has a lot of value, not an old animal, but a young animal, that it's actually going to kind of hurt the community in a way. And then your second question, which I'll also punt to someone who can know more, is why an animal that hasn't worked? Maybe also an animal that is still more valuable because it hasn't been worn out. Why the land? What's the connection with the land? Excellent. Yes, please.
So I have an idea about this. My thought was that the idea is about the place of pollution. They take this animal that has not been involved in the community. They take it to a place that has no agricultural connection, where the water is going to be flowing. They say, essentially, put all the guilt here, and it's going to get carried down the stream, and if the stream doesn't stop flowing, then the guilt won't end up anywhere.
Okay, really fascinating. So it kind of has like a tashlich kind of, we're going to throw breadcrumbs in the water, they go away. I always tell a story. I did tashlich a couple years ago in Boston, And the only problem with that was someone was doing tashlich like 100 feet the other way, and I couldn't see, and new breadcrumbs were coming down in front of me. But of course, the stream, okay, we're actually saying we're going to do this, but it's going to then be dispelled, and we need to actually, in the case of uncertainty, we need to find a ritual where we can move this away and move on. David, please.
Two questions occurred to me. One is the ritual seems to be a collective ritual, like expiating the nearest town's collective guilt. But the heifer has to come from someone in the town. So presumably there's actually a person whose heifer is taken for this, unless there was some practice of collective ownership of heifers that I'm not aware of. And then number two, the ritual saying is interesting. Although I guess, well, what they say is that we didn't do this.
Right.
And it's not clear if that means we, the elders, didn't do this, or we, the town, didn't do this. And if the latter, then it's kind of interesting because the whole fact is that we don't know who did it, so maybe it actually is the case that somebody in the town did it.
Okay, so if it's unknown, how can you say something so definitive? It almost feels like a binding, or we certify that we didn't do it, but we don't know yet. Yeah, Alex, please.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there was the choice not to try to pin it on someone. I think in these other Holy Ghost rituals where people would get like dunked in the water, and the person who floated up was guilty. So, either way, you either drowned or you floated up. But a very different goal, which was to find a guilty individual rather than to say collectively accepting the responsibility and trying to deal with it.
Fascinating. And we know, unfortunately, a number of stories where in the rush to pin the guilt on someone, it comes out later that they're exonerated, they didn't do it. This might feel, and maybe this isn't what you're saying, but it sounds like this could be a healthier approach to deal with this as a community than to try to pin guilt on.
To really tear your community apart or pin it on somebody who's not.
Yeah, fascinating. Is there anyone over here saying this? Yeah.
Where I'm struggling with this a little bit, and I like all the reasons that we've come up with for why we're doing this down in a wadi with the flowing water and all of that, but if this is meant to be a public ritual and a public atonement, going down into the wadi, into the valley, out of sight of everything, isn't a very public atonement. To me, this feels like a ritual that really should be happening at the gates of the town, whatever town you've decided is the one that is collectively responsible. They're going far away.
Right.
Which I find strange.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Maybe perhaps the rabbi's answer might actually shed some light on why Alpha. Right, if it's something we're actually trying to announce to the whole community, why go to the edge? Yes, please.
Yeah, I was getting the imagery also of how the Chazan during Rosh Hashanah, during the Hineni, is walking down kind of on behalf of the whole congregation, and that's what it is. It's the elders of the town are doing it on behalf, not necessarily in front of the congregation, but they're taking on the responsibility
Right.
of the
Right.
cleansing.
Beautiful.
The slaying of the heifer is some sort of a reenactment, if you will, of the murder. Well, the murder was done out of sight of anybody, so doing it down where no one can see it would make perfect sense.
Okay, so if we're trying to make this as a substitute or reenactment, right, doing it in the other place. The rabbis are not going to answer all of our questions now, but I want to talk about some of. Did you do something, Mark? I'm sorry. Okay. I want to.
Did they say anything about what happens to the animal after it's been sacrificed?
Or the body?
I'm not certain, but it's something that we should look up later. Rabbis of the Mishnah ask a really interesting question, which I think we've alluded to a little bit in this discussion. So the Hebrews on the first page, I'm just going to read on the back. The elders of the city would then wash their hands, this is repeating the verse, in water in the place of the breaking of the neck of the heifer, and they would recite, "Our hands did not spill this blood, nor did our eyes see." And the rabbis asked, and the Mishnah asked, "V'chi al datenu alta sheziknei beit din shofchei damin hen?" if it came to your mind, are basically saying, do we really believe that the elders of the court are spilling blood? Basically meaning, we know that these specific elders were not the ones that, murdered the person. Why are they the ones that need to take responsibility for the community? Rather, they mean to declare that the victim did not come to us, and then we let him take his leave without food, and we did not see him, and then leave him alone to depart without accompaniment. They therefore attest they took care of all of his needs and are responsible for his death even indirectly. Are not responsible for his death even indirectly. And the priests recite, "Forgive, Lord, your people Israel, whom you redeemed, and suffer not innocent blood to remain in the midst of your people Israel." They did not have to recite the conclusion of the verse, "and the blood shall be forgiven to them," as this is not part of the priest's statement, but rather the divine spirit informs them, when you do so, the blood is forgiven for you. So the Mishnah actually tries to expand, basically the Mishnah tries to get these elders off the hook and says that their declaration is saying, not only did we not kill this person, but we did everything we possibly could do to make sure that they wouldn't be put in this situation. But I think this Midrash right below actually says the opposite, which I think is a little bit more powerful and almost uses their words against them a bit. The Midrash is talking about these words, "Our hands have not spilled blood." The elders saying, "We have not spilled the blood." Now would it enter our minds that the elders of the Beit Din, of the court, are spillers of blood? The intent is, the slain one was not in our hands and dismissed without a meal, and we did not see him, corresponding to our eyes had not seen, and let him go without an escort. I think what's happening in this text is a really interesting interplay. The rabbis are trying to, on one hand, get themselves off the hook by saying we did everything we could, and yet we know at the same time that if they actually had done everything that they possibly could, presumably this wouldn't happen. So hanging over this is some of their culpability indirectly for the murder of this person. And this creates this category of accompaniment that is described in the same section in the Talmud in source 4. Rabbi Meir would say there is a coercion with regard to accompaniment, meaning that the community can require someone to walk a stranger out of the town to the next town. Rabbi Meir says, because one who does not want to accompany another nevertheless is required to do so, as the reward for accompaniment is without measure. It's a really fascinating idea. There are a few things to say that this is without measure. It's really talking about the idea that there's something unknown. When we accompany someone into another place, we don't know what they're going to face. And the only way that we can protect them is by walking hand in hand with them. And by it being something without measure, I think it's because it could be that the path was going to be totally safe, and the accompaniment, even if the person had gone by themselves, they would have been fine. And on the other hand, maybe they actually would have faced danger. We actually don't know until we accompany the person into that other place. The rabbis are opening up kind of by their opposite. The text is saying, they're saying, oh, we're trying to just, not be guilty because we did everything we could. But I think that all of these texts always have a shadow side. They know on some level that they didn't do. And when they say, we're going to see in a minute, I didn't excerpt that part from this article, but he says, when they say our eyes didn't see, and our hands didn't touch, they say, yeah, our eyes didn't see the person go into this place, and we didn't provide what we could have provided to keep this person safe. There's a great article in Tikkun magazine a decade ago about this text. Will someone read this final source 5? Maybe connecting some of this to our own understanding. Please, Anna.
The logic of Leviah accompaniment says that the justness of a city is a function of the web of relationships between strangers, people who are anonymous to each other. If people can fall into a place that is beyond anybody's responsibility, this is a reflection of the justness of the city itself. This is when the city needs to atone. Accompaniment as a practice exists for both the individual and the city. The actual accompaniment of guests out of one's house, as the invoking of the Abrahamic ideal of hospitality, is a token of remembrance that the boundaries of responsibility extend beyond the boundaries of intimacy. implies the practice of reaching out beyond ourselves is also a performance of accompaniment. This practice starts with paying attention to the other people whose paths we cross.
Okay. So possibly a reason why you're going out to the side, there's kind of like it's kind of like going to that place that's not well lit, the dark area of the town, and saying, like, well, why were we not here before? Why were we not taking responsibility for this place? Aryeh Cohen writes something really, really beautiful, that an unjust city is a place where people can get lost, where no one is responsible for that place. A place, he suggests that accompaniment is actually a practice of, it's not just a practice of chesed and kindness, but a practice of communal responsibility. And while it can be so easy to just say, I'm responsible for my own town, my own area, and someone else will deal with the other, that is the definition of injustice, that a community could build spaces in which someone could be no one's responsibility. And in response to that, the closest town has to take responsibility and say, we could have accompanied the person out into the wilderness, and we chose not to. Any comments or questions or reactions to this?
When I was looking at the part where the elders of the town were it just made it seem so clear that they weren't responsible. It makes me think how cynical we are now, where we assume that the people in charge are the most corrupt.
Okay. You're in.
I think like the last part where we talk about this idea of the justness of a city, of like making relationships, and we're like, you can't get lost, and just thinking about like the real struggle that our city is in, like now, in terms of still kind of the astronomical amount of violence, and we can't be here sitting in this building in this city and not recognize that like we're part of that too, and that includes those of us who live in the city and who come here, or those of us who don't, like that we accompany to greater and lesser extent in and of like our neighborhood, around our shul, and that impacts the city.
Beautiful. I think that's the rich spiritual question that doesn't have such a clear answer in this moment, that we can kind of keep chewing and spinning in our heads for a while. So if it is a place of no ownership, of no one's land, and yet we need to find a way to be responsible, how do we do that? And how do we work with the towns near us? And how do we do it, especially if, you're describing places that actually have people who are part of town. These are not owner-led, people live in all parts of the city. So how do we do that in a way that's respectful to all of the people in our city, our country? I don't think we have a clear answer. I think that sounds like good work to at least spend Shabbat thinking about, and then on and on. But of course, the mandate of this parsha and the rabbi's interpretation is pretty clear. That to live a Jewish life and a just life is to accompany each other and to find ways as a community to take responsibility for the places that go beyond our city. Shabbat shalom.